How you guys doing? You guys doing all right? Yeah, I know I'm the last talk, so hopefully you guys aren't wiped out. So actually, can we bring up the house lights just a little bit? I can't see anybody, and the light is shooting me right in the face. Okay, all right. Yeah, so I'm gonna do a presentation today on a theme that's really important to me called how to give presence to the unrepresentable. The theme is inspired by realizing that there's certain things in life that once you try to picture it, then it kind of flattens out and loses its magic. It's like if you had a dream and then you tried to share that dream with someone. Have you guys had this experience? And then every time you retell the dream, it becomes less and less about the dream and more about like the story. Have you guys ever had that happen? Right? So you realize it's like if you tell people about the dream, then it most likely it changes the dream. So sometimes you just have to keep it to yourself, right? Or, remember when you were in high school and you really liked somebody in your class and then they didn't like you, but they liked somebody else. And then the person that they liked didn't like them. They liked somebody else. Do you guys remember that? Am I the only one? I'm not the only one. Okay, there's more than one person who was loveless in high school. But the thing is that I remember the longing for that person way more than if I would have had a relationship with that person, right? So within the talk, actually I have one more example. So any horror fans in the room? Any people here like horror movies? Okay. None of the people in the back, you're not horror fans at all? No one? Okay. Romantic comedy types in the back? You prefer a good romance? Okay. So, in horror films, to me, the best horror movies are the ones that you don't see the monster, but you just feel its effects, right? Like if you've seen Jaws, the first part of Jaws is better than the ending because you just see the blood in the water, or you hear the da-na, na-na, na-na, but right, you never really see the shark until the very end. And by that point, the movie's already over because at some point they're gonna kill the shark, right? And send it back to the depths of hell. So over the last 20 years of my career, and I'm a visual artist originally from Los Angeles. I have worked across numerous disciplines, from drawing, painting, sculpture, socially engaged work, practice, to making films. And most recently, over the last 5 years, I've been working in theater. In each one of those domains, when I switch it around, it allows me to kind of embrace this essence of a beginner. Like learning to ride a bike every single time. And at some point you're gonna crash, right? But hopefully at the end you make a cool crash. It looks interesting. So anyway, but what I've tried to do across working in these different domains is to come up with some methods and approaches that I feel have some sort of essence of a truth to them. And I've been able to derive that truth by applying a certain set of ideas across various domains. And I'm gonna share those approaches with you today. So the way I'm gonna do my presentation is that I'm gonna talk about 3 of my projects. The ones in pink are the ones that we have enough time we'll get to. And actually, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna take a little poll of the room and see which path you all want us to go. And then I'm gonna show you those methods and approaches in a very abstracted way. I'll go back. I'll tell you about the shooter photograph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back. I'm going to show them in a very kind of abstracted way, just to really illustrate the core principles. And then we'll look at some examples within my own practice. And then from there, we'll talk. And if you guys have any questions or anything like that, we'll get into them. Now, we have 2 paths we can go. Like you see behind me, there's 3 projects where I'm going to talk about decentering, dislocation, and the gutter. But there are 2 more in pink, and maybe we could think of those as bonuses. Now, we can do a deep dive If we focus on 3, we can go deeper. Now we do 5, we get to see more, but we kind of go a little less deep into the methods and approaches. So who prefers to see all 5, or who prefers all 3? So let's take a show of hands. Who prefers just to focus on 3? Raise your hands up high. This is not a hand-raising group, and it's only one person. 2 people. Okay, well then let's see what happens with 5. Okay, you want to see us do 5, go across all 5. Oh, that's why you didn't raise your hands. Okay, now I understand. That's how this works. Okay, let's see how we do. All right, so I'm going to be using the whiteboard over here to talk about these 3 concepts. Now, this works best if you guys treat this as a conversation. And let me first ask, does everybody understand me? I know speaking in English in a non-English speaking country. So is everyone able to follow me okay? Is there anyone who's... No hands going up. Okay, all right. We are at the American University, but I just want to make sure. I don't want to be presumptuous. So how do we make present things which are unrepresentable? So the first technique that method I'm going to talk about is called decentering. Can you read this from there? Yes or no? Can you guys read this? Is my handwriting poor, or is it just too small? You cannot read it. Do you want to sit over here? Is it my handwriting is poor? Okay. It says decentering is the word. So pushing something out of the middle is the idea. So let's imagine if you're in a theater similar to the one that you're in right now. Okay, and these are people in the theater, the backs in the back of their heads, and there's on the stage a wall that divides the left and the right of the stage. On this side of the stage, we have someone on the phone, and they're very upset because they're making a call, and they're looking for someone. And then on the other side of the room, other side of the wall, there's a bed, and there's a lump, and there's all this movement coming out of the lump. You don't actually see what's happening because it's underneath the blanket, right? Here's the bed. And then over here on the corner of that bed, there's a cell phone going off. Buzz, 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 buzz. Okay? So as the director of this play, am I asking you to focus on the A side of the stage? Or am I asking you to focus on the B side of the stage or elsewhere? This is an interactive presentation, so I can't actually go any further unless somebody from the audience gives me... Huh? No. You can see everything, but the character on this side can't see what's happening over here because there's a wall dividing the left and the right of the stage. So as a director and as an audience member, what are we asking you to focus on? Yes, both, right, exactly. What I'm asking you to do is to focus on C, which is the combination of both sides, right? And the idea here is that the entirety of the picture is not in the center of the frame, right? It's being pushed out of the center, and then what we're asking you to do as the audience member, as the person who is sitting there in the room, watching the show, all right, that's a drawing of a person smiling, if you didn't catch that. What we're asking you to do is to take A and B and combine them together in your brain, within the mind's eye. So it makes you, as a participant, completely essential to the telling of the story. Okay, so one strategy, I'm able to bring something into the room is by pushing it out of the middle and then forcing the audience to merge it together. Okay, so this is the strategy known as decentering. So again, I'm going to show you these methods, and then I'm going to go back and then show you some ways in which I've tried to use them. Okay, so this next one is known as a dislocation. Okay, so let's imagine you are standing in a museum and you're looking at a painting by Cezanne of a tree, let me write down. This method is known as dislocation. Okay, so introduce a couple terms. The two terms are okay, excuse my bad handwriting. This is content, and then the other one is subject. So these terms are used differently in semiotics or in poetry or in other domains I use differently. So I want to clarify it here. So content, for the sake of our conversation, is like what's in the picture. And then the subject is what is it about? Okay. So if you're going to see an Impressionist painting, what in general were the Impressionists interested in? Like what distinguished their mode of inquiry versus, say, the paintings that they would have grown up around from the Renaissance? Who said that? Oh, and a smart teenager in the room. Okay, yes. They were interested in light, right? Because they wanted to know how light worked within the eye, right? So when you walk up close to an Impressionist painting, they start to break apart. They actually start to vibrate. And then when you step away, they start to recombine back together and produces a unified field. So in the case of this painting by Cezanne, who I'm certain is rolling over in his grave with this very poor rendering of his work, the content of the painting is a tree. But as you pointed out, the subject is actually not tree, it's how we see tree. So in that way, what the painting is actually about, what it's speaking about, is not inside of the picture alone, right? It's not just pointing towards itself, but it points outside of itself into the eye and the mind of the viewer. So in that regards, I'm showing you something, but what I'm actually talking about is not in the picture, it's outside of it, right? Because it needs to be conjured within the imagination. Any questions about this? Is everybody following me? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay, I saw a little. Kevin was like, thumbs down. Okay, so content, subject. And again, it's about privileging the perspective of your audience as a necessary part of reading the image. And just to bring that concept home, this one, The Gutter, I got from this amazing book called Understanding Comics. And the author's name slips my mind at the moment. But it's this wonderful philosophical and conceptual inquiry into how comics work, how comics book work. It's an amazing book. If you don't know it, you should definitely have it in your library. So let me just do a little drawing here. Okay, so who would be bold enough to try to read my comic? I know, you're so overwhelmed by the beauty of its technique that you're like, Can I be so bold as to try to interpret this masterpiece? But I believe in you. What about you in the orange coat, because you're so visible? Yes. Yeah. Good. So let's just figure out what these objects are. So there's something very simple, 3 lines and a circle, right? So with something as abstract as these 4 elements, how are we able to read both velocity, speed, shift and scale, and perspective, right? How are we able to do that? In comics, they call that act closure. So when we read a comic strip, the way in which we're able to make 3 very separate things into a story is that we seam them together in our minds. And that act is known as closure. A good illustration of this is if you've ever played this game with a baby. You ever do the game with a baby where you hold something in front of their face and then they get totally confused and then you drop it back down again? You guys are familiar with this form of baby torture? The kid gets totally freaked out. And then they see you again, and they're like, oh my God, you're still there. And then you cover up their face, and they're like, where'd you go? Right? So a baby can't form closure because they don't really have the conceptual tools yet to do that. But in comics, we do. So if you guys haven't figured me out yet, the question is, are we able to read this as a sequence because of what's inside of the picture alone? Right? Is it only what's going on inside of the picture? Or is it something else? Anybody figured me out by now? Anybody want to take a guess? If there is something else, what is it? Yes. 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 And can you tell where that is in this picture? Yeah. You're almost there. It's actually not because of what's in the picture. It's because of the space in between the frames. And it's the space between the frames that they call the gutter. And the gutter is a space that we project ourselves into, and it's in that space that we seam them together and then make it whole. Right? So again, the gutter, as a strategy, what it does is that it centers the eye and the mind of the viewer as necessary to be able to produce cohesion and closure. And then by extension, you're able to bring your own personal relationship to the object. Maybe you lost your red balloon as a baby and you never forgot it, right? Or, maybe you used to go bowling and you remember had your favorite black bowling ball, or I'm not sure. But we all have our own sort of personal connection to images. And I think that some of the best art produces spaces. They produce a gutter, or in another term, they produce a gap. And in that gap, whenever we make art and we produce gaps, it allows us to project ourselves into it. Okay. All right. So let's go back. To the first one, which is decentering. Does anybody have any questions about any of these so far? Have I lost everyone? Are you guys still with me? 2 or 3 of you are still with me. All right, I can't ask for more than that. Okay, so the first project of mine where I'd sort of come to understand, I mean, these are methods and approaches that I've derived while making work and then retroactively looking back on projects. So one of these examples is called drawings of removal. I'm just gonna show you the images first, and then you can, then I'll come back and talk about them. Okay. So drawings of removal is a project that was inspired by a trip that I took with my father back to the city of Galveston and Beaumont, Texas. Texas is in the southern part of the United States, and it's still a relatively segregated city where, you know, blacks and other minorities have certain places they can access, and there's places that only whites can access. So that still sort of holds up to be true. So my father left Texas back in the 60s, and he hadn't been back there in more than 40 years. So I went back with him, and for him, it was an attempt to re-experience the past. But for me, it became about the inability to do so, because not only had his memories altered and changed, but the actual landscape itself had also changed. There were new streets that weren't there before. There were buildings that were missing. And the place where that became the most powerful was when we visited the home of my great-grandmother, his grandmother, who raised him, and her name was Black Mama. And this home that he grew up in was very special because his mother, my grandmother, had gave him up for adoption. He was about to be sent off to an orphanage, and she saved him and raised him up until he was 13 years old. And this house had all of his fond memories, but when we turned the corner, the only thing that remained was a grassy field and a tree stump. Everything was gone. So in this drawing, I drew what I thought the house looked like just based on his stories, and then my imagination trying to fill in those gaps. Within the project, what I would do is I would set up a space. Let me go back a little bit. I would set up a space where there were layers and layers of paper from the ceiling to the floor. And I would draw certain locations that we visited along that trip, like the cemetery where Black Mama was buried, or the barbecue restaurant, the oil refinery. And then I started drawing them in different phases of their life, right? You couldn't really tell if it was something was old and falling apart or if it was being built. And when you would walk into the room, I would be sitting there making these drawings, and I would be in there on average about 12 days. And I never had a plan of what I would do. I would only respond to the space when I was there, just so that I can just really just kind of be in the space of indeterminacy. And people would come in and they would talk to me and they would say, well, you know, what are you doing? When is it done? Like, how do I understand this? And just going back to this idea of decensoring, that when people walked in the room, because the entire drawing experience was all around them, it was fully immersive. The idea wasn't like reading a book. You didn't start on the left and read it to the right, or if you are, you know, reading Japanese from the right to the left. In Arabic, do you read from the right to the left as well, right? So there has no center. It has no middle in which you can have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's just a kind of a slowly kind of evolving activity. And in that way, I started to see art not as a series of objects, but as a series of activities, right? That art is something that evolves and changes, because art is really a force. It's an activity that operates on things. So when we went and visited Black Mama's grave, where I really had the idea for this project, was that we searched and searched and searched for her body, and we were never able to find it. And part of the reason for that is because my father only had the memory of a 12-year-old boy, that he only remembered there were cars passing by along the road. And we went there based on that little fragment of her memory. We were never able to find her. But these trees were like 400 years old, 500 years old, and they were like toppling over the tombstones. The cemetery was totally alive. It had just dumped down just a massive amount of rain. There were mosquitoes everywhere. There were birds chirping. The place was totally alive. And then I said to myself later, once I came home and kind of reflected on the experience, I said, well, maybe we couldn't find her, but she was actually there underground, but connected through these really old trees, you know, this underground system of relationships that was invisible to me. And then later on, doing drawings of the Texaco oil refinery, that same metaphor of these deep pipes, you know, these roots underground extracting things and bringing it to the surface, was another metaphor, which inspired me to work on this project. I wanted to point out something that kind of really taught me something about art making, which was this slide I'm trying to illustrate it. So when I was conceptualizing this project, the idea was that the people who would come and see the show would actually see it evolving over time. So if you came on Monday and you came on Friday, you would see a very different experience, right? Because things were constantly moving. I would draw something, I would cut it out of the wall, I would take it and lay it on the floor. So it was constantly changing. But what that meant was that I had to figure out a fast way of drawing. And the solution that I came with was using a ruler and a slide rail. So when I'm drawing with a ruler, I can move it very quickly, I can draw very quickly. But this is something that it taught me about the relationship between tools and abilities. Because the ruler enabled me a certain expediency, right? But what it did at the same time is it prevented me from being able to draw certain kinds of things, like organic stuff, like a tree or a cloud, or this is meant to be a mudslide that it came down and collapsed onto a car. And it feels very unnatural to render things in this way. And what it taught me was that sometimes the best way to express something is by showing the limits of its expression, that you just can't quite get there, right? So you can feel the mud even more profoundly because it doesn't actually look like real mud. It just conjures it in your imagination, right? Oh man, I don't want to mess up. Hold on one second. Let me just make sure. So Moataz Nasser's piece out in the desert. To me, the piece is so powerful because it actually conjures the ocean. It conjures the river because of the repetition of the oars, right? So when you see it, you can actually imagine those oars moving through the water because that's how ships move. It's through a kind of rhythmic rotation. And if you've walked through that piece, in my mind, it actually conjures the river, not because we see water, but because of the absence of water. Does that make sense? Anybody have any observations? No? Okay, all right. So in one other project that I worked on, which is called Until. This one is based on it looks like I'm actually in the audience. That's pretty cool. This one is based on a play of, let's see, how do I explain this? Actually, I'm not going to explain it because I have it in a trailer. The sound people in the back, I'm gonna need your help. The audio on this is kind of low, so I'm gonna need them to turn it up a little bit. Just a warning. So this is a trailer that I made for the play, and it actually describes the work pretty well.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you know, at the turn of the century, was a segregated theater. And a black man, in order to appear at a white man's show, had to put on a black face so no one would know. And one of the giant stars of that area, the Ziegfeld, was Bert Williams. And he kind of made fun of men's follies and foibles through his humor. And here tonight, to play tribute to Bert Williams is Berin.
My name is Edgar Arceneaux, and I'm a Los Angeles-based artist and filmmaker. 20 years ago, I saw video footage of a performance given by Berin at Ronald Reagan's inaugural ball in 1981. In it, Ben wears blackface and performs a moving tribute to pioneer African-American actor Bert Williams. When ABC broadcast the performance the following day, they intentionally omitted the last part containing the critique. Audiences only saw Ben in blackface performing a minstrel show, lampooning Black Americans. Outrage ensued, creating a fierce media backlash by the very community he was there to represent. The aftermath left Ben isolated, derailed his career, and made him feel like a man without a country. So the progressive politics of Ben's performance has never been fully understood.
Is that right?
Oh, you want to see the video?
Until is my new live-action play, commissioned by Performer in New York, that will restage Ben Berin's intended performance so contemporary audiences can experience it in full force.
I just forget my place sometimes. Yes, sir.
So just to be clear about the history, so the actor Ben Berin, who in the 1980s was a hugely popular performer, was like Denzel Washington of that time period, did a performance in which only 50% of it, only half of it was shown to American audiences. So the first half was a pretty true to form, was a true to form minstrel show, which is a highly stylized, stereotype version of Black male identity, kind of very subservient, that was popular in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. So he did that performance, but then he also had a second part that contained a critique. But ABC Television, the network that was airing it, had edited out the second part. So American audiences back home just saw him doing this very derogatory stereotype in front of like 20,000 white Republicans. So you can imagine that his audience that really loved him up until that point, they just basically tore him apart. And there was no social media, so, we didn't have Amy's art, we didn't have the art newspaper to tell Ben Berin's side of the story. So he basically just got roasted. People spit in his face, he got death threats, and he carried this burden with him for more than 30 years. So when I was offered the opportunity to tell that show, tell that story within a play, I really was, I tried to figure out a way of bringing, that, that's him holding the hat here. I really tried to figure out a way of bringing the experience of having not seen it back in 1981. Like, how do we bring this experience in 1981 into, the present, which was, 2015 at the time? Like, how do you connect these two histories together? And the way in which I did that, and I'll show you this image again, is that in the beginning of the show, the audience is actually sitting on this side of the curtain. But by the end of the show, everyone has moved through the curtain and they're sitting on the same side of the stage as Ben Berin. So in that way, it allowed for me to bridge that gap, both physically, the distance from you all to me, right? Imagine if I brought all of you up here and then you had to sit around me during quarantine, during post-COVID lockdown, right? If you guys were all sitting around me, you would have a very different experience with my presentation. But in my show, what I did is that I slowly brought everybody behind the curtain, and then they got to see the full 10-minute performance the way in which it was intended. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with Broadway history, how many of you guys have seen the movie The Wizard of Oz? Are you familiar with it? You know, Dorothy had a daughter. Her name is Liza Minnelli. Do you guys know who Liza Minnelli is? No, some of you guys may know if you've ever seen Chicago or any other like big Broadway shows. Anyway, she's huge. She's like massively important theater person. Anyway, that's the actual person. Ben Berin is sitting here, and then that's Liza Minnelli sitting next to him, which made this show so surreal to have an actor performing yourself, doing a performance about a guy who was born 100 years before then. Right? It's just like this echo of time. So again, in my strategy, what I was trying to do was to de-center, a very painful stereotype, which is blackface, by showing you a story which focused on the effects that it had on Ben Berin's life, as opposed to telling a pretty straightforward tale. Okay, I'm going to show you guys another video, and then I'm going to move on to the next point.
In full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one.
So the title of the exhibition is called Book in the Meadow. And the show is made up of three major movements and then a number of sub-movements that kind of operate as glue and kind of glue. This letter was sent to Dr. King in December of 1964, about 5 months before he was to receive the Nobel Prize. The letter basically says that King, we know what you've been doing, we know what you really are, that you're a fraud, and that if you don't stop what you're doing, we're going to expose your secrets. And then at the end, it says, you should just kill yourself. The letter is highly redacted. It's not clear who redacted it, if it was the King family, the state, or if it was the FBI. It turns out it was the group that actually sent him the letter, anonymously. In February of 19, this letter was sent by Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, basically saying that her two brothers, Dexter and Martin Luther King III, are suing her over the Nobel Peace Prize and the Bible, Dr. King, and they want to sell it to a private collection. Okay. So this project, The Book in a Meadow, is looking at the history of Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights activist who was assassinated in 1968. Is there anyone here who's unfamiliar with who Martin Luther King is? Should I try to? No, everybody's got it. Okay. So the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And the FBI sent him a letter threatening him, basically saying, King, we know you're a fraud. Your end is approaching. You could have been our greatest leader, but you're done. And basically it's like, you should just kill yourself, is what it says at the end of the letter. The FBI had been following a lot of civil rights leaders around, and Martin Luther King, it was rumored that he had extramarital affairs. And it turns out that it's true. I actually know a couple people who used to hang out with him. That was his weak spot was women, I guess. And the FBI had recordings of it. So the letter was sent in 1964 and it was released to the public, and I found it interesting because it was so highly redacted. And then coincidentally, within 6 months of that letter being released, this letter came out, which was from Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter. And basically it said that her two brothers, Martin Luther King III and Lester, were suing her because they wanted to sell the Nobel Peace Prize and the Bible, but she doesn't want to give it to them. And then they were in court suing each other, right? This would be like comparable to like, Harry, Princess Diana's kids like suing each other in court. Like they're basically like our royal family of the United States, since we don't really have, a king and queen. So what I was interested in was how these two objects, this letter and this letter, how they came out to the press 50 years apart from each other. But then it raised like a bigger question, which was, what changed the book, the Bible, and the Nobel Prize, right? If physically it's still the same book, and physically it's still the same metal, why did the brothers think that it was worth selling, right? Anybody want to take a guess? And you can't say that it's for the money, because they're all really rich. Anybody want to guess? Amy, do you have any thoughts? Yeah, why did the brothers think it was worth selling? No, it wasn't about money. Well, what it was is that the brothers believed that it was no longer a tool, and they believed that it was a relic. They believed it was no longer useful, and by extension, it should be sold. So I said to myself, well, what was it that changed it? If it's physically still the same paper, if it's still the same book, and it's physically still the same metal, what changed it? And the change was an economic force. An economic force transitioned them from tools into relics and turned them into, what is the word for something that you buy at a store? Old furniture, what do they call it? They turned it into an antique, right? So this project that I was trying to do by showing you those 5 panes was to say that that force that changed the two things from one side to the other was an economic force, even though the two things were physically still the same object. Okay. All right. How are we doing? I just want to take a temperature of the room. How are we doing, buddy, in the striped shirt? How are you doing? Are you doing all right? Yeah, you. Yeah. What's your name? Mustafa. How are we doing, Mustafa? Are you still with me? Are we together on this journey? All right. So, and then who's sitting next to you, Mustafa? Who's your friend? Colette? Wallet. Okay, did I mess that up? Wallet? All right. How are we doing? Huh? Oh, she said, obviously it's great. I like that. I called on the right person. I'm glad I didn't call on Gina. She'd be like, it's doing okay. All right, so I wanted to talk about the gutter. And this is one of my earliest drawings that I made back in 1996. Do you guys know who these people are? Is there anyone confused? What about you, buddy, in the blue shirt? Do you know who these people are? None of them? Do you ever see the TV show Star Trek? Huh? You don't know Star Trek? Let's see. Anybody want to help them out? Anybody here? I might have showed the absolutely wrong drawing to this group. I'll be explaining this one for the next half an hour. Okay, well, these two are fictitious aliens from a TV show called Star Trek. Very hugely popular show because it was the vision of the future that had gotten past capitalism and had gotten past racism and a lot of the things that divide us as a human race. And the show came out in the 1960s and the 70s, I believe. And it was really, really popular. And they have, it's like Star Wars, but better than Star Wars. Not to offend anyone. And this guy over here is a rapper. His name is Tupac Shakur. And Tupac was a very popular musician in the 90s. he wound up being shot and killed, like a lot of rappers do. You know, they wind up getting murdered by some rival. So this guy right here in the middle, his name is Tupac, and he's also a Vulcan, but he's black. So what's significant about that? If you don't know, like, Star Trek, then maybe it's not that significant. But for me, you know, Spock was this intellectual, but he represented, he was like a Jewish intellectual, like projected into outer space, right? But the thing, his character is interesting because he's half human and half alien. And the alien, he's a Vulcan, and Vulcans are supposed to suppress their emotions. So he was constantly in conflict with himself. So I actually really loved him as a character. But then this black one came out in the new series called Star Trek: The Next Generation. And that character was 100% Vulcan. And I was really interested in that because in the States, I don't know about here, but in the US, black characters are typically presented as people that don't use their mind, but they're like physically, they're known as sensates. So they like experience the world through their physicality, you know. So I was really intrigued by this person. So I wanted to make a drawing about these two. But every time I said Tuvok and Spock, then the word Tupac Shakur popped into my head. I didn't really understand why, but it just kept happening. And what I realized is by including Tupac in this drawing, that it allowed for me to produce a sense of closure amongst two of the characters, but never all three. So just to go back to this comic, so the idea with a comic strip is that 1, 2, 3 is there to produce the beginning, a middle, and an end, right? A beginning and then a conclusion. And that's sort of what the mind seeks. But when it comes to constructions of race, at least within the US, we have these dominant narratives that want to put white people in one category and black people in the other. And I realized by including Tupac in the drawing, it allowed for me to produce a series of relationships in which you can never fully produce closure, right? And in that way, it becomes an idea machine, right? You're just constantly bouncing each other's relationship off of each other in a way in which the work is constantly pointing away from itself. It's dependent upon the intelligence of the viewer, right? It's a kind of practice which is inherently inclusive. And it means that the work is never complete because each person's perspective, if my friend in the orange jacket or my new friend in the blue shirt or my two new friends here could come to a different kind of relationship with the work, right? You can probably generally agree on certain things, but your perspective and yours coming from two different places means that you have a particular point of view. And by relying on strategies that try to make things present without representing them, it means that my position is really there to open up your imagination, as opposed to saying, this is what I mean, right? I don't want to conjure in you a dynamic relationship. Because like I said, you know, when that girl that I liked in high school, who I still think about on occasion, 30 years later, those are sometimes the most powerful experiences. So I'm a little bit hesitant to go into the new work, but maybe I could just show it to you really quickly, and then we can like do a Q&A. So I'm working on a new play about Milli Vanilli and Boney M. Is any Boney M fans in here? One, two, yeah, that tends to be the response. I've been in Africa, I've been in France. They're all like, yeah, I grew up with it, but you know. So anyway, so I'm making a play about Boney M and Milli Vanilli. But anyway, but I wanted to show you just these paintings that I've been making recently, which essentially are, I figured out a way of skinning a mirror. So taking silver from the glass and then turning it into a painting process. So this is just a diary video that I made for myself, not for anyone but me. So I'm going to show it to you anyway. But it's just me just kind of geeking out on having made one of these recently and being like, what the hell is this? What did I just do? Okay, here you go. just kind of pushed it a little bit with my fingers just to test it, to see how wet it was, just debating on if it was too wet for me to pull that paint off. And then here, it's just that it didn't entirely dry, so when it starts, when you pull it off, it's like the skin, it's peeling off the body, where you got like burn, like this. Very visceral. So I'm just gonna skip ahead. I just want to show you a few more of these. I'll just show them to you. So again, these are all mirrors. If you walk up to them, they reflect you. And the idea with these is that instead of a mirror reflecting you back to yourself, the mirror is you. All our scrapes, our scars, our experiences, the broken hearts, the love, the loss. And because it's silver, they actually age over time. So this is what the painting looks like today. When I first made it, it looked like that. So they age and they turn brown, just like a body does. This is 1 year of aging. It's kind of a beautiful patina. Anyway, I'm not going to get into these bigger ideas. I just wanted to show you how they work. Okay. Maybe I'll just leave it on this image. And end my talk there. Thank you. So we have 3 minutes for questions. I am asking for none because I don't want them. Reverse psychology. I don't want any questions, especially any difficult ones.
Say something about that last body of work.
These scanning the mirror pieces? Sure. Yeah. So these are, material-based abstractions. So the process that you're looking at here is that the painting that you're seeing in there, the stuff in the pinks and the yellows that you're seeing is actually, you could almost think of it as like the glue. It's a lot of the actual brushwork and things like that is actually sandwiched between the silver and the canvas itself. So any of the color that you see coming out in these paintings is because it's pushing itself from the background forward, and it's pushing itself out through the cracks and the gaps, right? Which is kind of my big theme for my talk today, which is that I think that the work that I find the most powerful is the stuff that expresses itself through the gaps, is through the cracks, And something in the background is trying to be known and it's just showing itself just a little bit. So just for scale purposes, this painting is it's 9 feet. I don't know how many meters is 9 feet. 3 meters by 4.5 meters. 4.5 feet. So that one is pretty big. Yeah. Anyway, my aspiration is to come and make some of these here in Cairo. Is my dream project. And some of you may actually find this interesting, but the reason why the paintings change like this, the silver changes like this, is because it's oxidizing, right? So if you have like jewelry or knives and forks at home, silver eventually turns a little bit green or a little blue. That happens in these as well, but it turns brown mainly. And I was talking to a scientist who I invited to my studio because I wanted to really understand why it did this. why it went from this to this. And he said it's because of a protein that makes up nitrate that's part of the atmosphere, and that it's actually organic. It's an organic process when silver turns brown, which means that if I made these paintings here, I'd be able to absorb some of that 7,500-year-old oxygen you guys have floating around in this amazing city. So I'm plotting to come here next year and find a space to make some of these, because the oxidization process takes. This one is about a year. Sometimes it could be 6 months. I just need to make them and then leave them and then come back for them, So anyway, so if anyone here wants to support me to come back in 2022, let me know. Thank you. Yes. No, trust me, I've tried. The material is so thin. It's as thin as the skin on your body, actually thinner than the skin on your arm. And if you just rub it a couple times, it just comes right off. It's very delicate. So what I have to do is at a certain point, after it's browned long enough, then I have a technique that I use to seal it, and then it stops. So yeah. Yeah. Say again now? Say it a little bit louder, Gina. Oh, well, if I told you that, Gina, then I would share all of my secrets. Then yeah, that would have to. Then there would be 25 people in Cairo making these, and I would have no chance, because they'd make them better than I would. They'd make them much better than me. Let me zoom in on this image just so you can kind of see a little more. Oh, there you go. You can just see a little bit more of the detail. We're over time by 2 minutes. If you humor me, I'll share with you one anecdote about these paintings. Unless you all are ready to run out of here. The guy in the blue shirt is like, I'm so ready to leave. I'm sorry. You're in the light. You're wearing a blue shirt. I can see you the most. Like this guy in the brown totally blends in. So it's just because I can see you that I'm making you part of my show. So thank you for your unwilling participation. Okay, so in 2018, my mother was diagnosed with dementia, which is a neurological disorder. It's basically kind of a breaking down of the mind. And around that same time that my mother was sick, I was also going through a separation and divorce from my wife, and then my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, had a massive heart attack and died, and sort of all around that same time period. When I started making these paintings, it was my intention, as you've seen with my earlier work, to do something radically different than anything I'd done before. And one of the ways in which I decided to do that was to work purely in a material-based abstraction and not try to tell any story at all, but just let the materials express themselves. But, at a certain point in my mother's health, me and my 5 brothers and sisters became my mother's nurse. My mother was raised Catholic. She was very religious. And the idea of her children taking care of her, feeding her, brushing her teeth, undressing her, bathing her, like she would just die right away. Like she would just scream and die, So, I was in the evenings, I would be in my studio working on these paintings, and then in the afternoon or in the morning, I would be undressing my mom. And when you get older, your skin really starts to change, and seeing the wrinkles in my mother's stomach, the place where me and my brothers came from, and just sort of being in the face of all of that vulnerability, but also beauty too. There's so much poetics that comes from the person who was the child now becoming the parent, and that cycle of life is very powerful to experience. But I was making these paintings at night, and it wasn't until I made where did it go? The video I just showed you. It wasn't until the one that I made it wasn't until I made this one that I realized that even though I was trying to keep my personal life and my artwork separated, they somehow had become entangled. Because the scratches and the wrinkles and all these other things that I was becoming deeply fascinated by were the same experiences that I was having at home. And in that way, this material abstraction, this breaking and this fracturing took on another resonance because, as a friend told me once, when the mother dies, everything breaks, And I have continued to think about my mom. She passed away in January of this year. And I was very fortunate to be able to be there with her during that transition. And it was when she passed, and it just shows just how much of an artist I really am, because even when she had just passed and we're all there with her, I was like, oh, this is why poetry exists. Like, you can't explain what just happened just telling someone the facts. This is where poetry comes from. And I also then understood by extension where abstraction came from. It's getting at those things that are difficult to express so directly, but you can pull the attributes out of it. You can extract the core essences of it. Of my experience with the loss of my mom. But they are in some very real way a way for me to contend with that loss, to get close to it and realize that nothing will ever be the same, but we're still whole, right? These pieces may be broken, but they're still all together and intact. Okay, that's it. I'm done. And I only got one question. See that? I told you I didn't want any. Actually, I got 2 or 3. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Hey, if you want to stay in touch with me, I don't think I put it in here. These are the other 2 things I was going to talk about, but we ran out of time. But if you want to be in touch with me, you can follow me on Instagram at Edgar_3. And then we can stay in touch. Yeah? Okay, there's my Instagram handle. All right, thank you, everyone.